Footsteps in the dark. One bright afternoon in some past life, the telephone rang. I cannot say the year to be exact, but what I can say is it was before the rise of mobile cellular devices and GPS, and I was a very old man who could hardly get around my own house. It was a lovely house, with 4 stories, not counting the basement, for nobody truly used that portion of the manor, not for decades even. With a grand set of stairs that rose to the top levels, which I could scale in 15 minutes minimum in my old age. I generally slept in a recliner near the television and a rotary phone. It rang and rang as I rose up with my cane and made my limping leg carry me towards it. I picked up the receiver and held it to my weak ears. Hello? Grady, this is Harold. I've just landed at PDX. I've got the rental car agency on hold. Apparently there is a delay on my reservation. I may have to stay a night in a hotel, but they say the rain will hit in the morning and I get car sick easy. Oh, Harry, let me call you a cab tomorrow when the rain dies down. Perhaps it won't be as bad as they say. The words I spoke seemed not to register with Harold, as he sounded like he was whispering to some giggling woman, perhaps a clerk somewhere in the airport. Even my ears could tell. The sun was about to start setting, and I understood Harold was a man of business, so I told him to do what he needed to do. However, I added, most taxicabs don't go past the edge of my driveway, which goes through the redwoods and Douglas firs that have been here long before this house. The taxicabs were gracious enough to drive from Portland to outskirts of country villages like Glide, if you even want to call Glide a real village. It is mostly wilderness, rivers, and forest as far as the eye can see. I warned him that the driveway was treacherous at night and that he'd better wait for a rental. Believe me, I regret that I did nothing more than insist, for Harold stubbornly chose to come anyways. I brewed some coffee despite having been awake since dawn. I searched the pantry for sugar and found merely a cup left. Here I am preparing for a guest hours from now, and I've barely a thing to feed him. In all fairness, Harold told me that he was to arrive a month from today. With offers on the house, it appears the bank of the interested buyer finalized a loan quicker than Harold thought. I turned on my porch light and the radio, and I had propped up in the screen window. It was a fine summer afternoon to sit on the porch and watch as a pale but darker blue twilight took over the pink and orange hues of sunset. There was not a cloud in the sky, and I sat in the rocking chair listening to my program of jazz music, the music I missed out on in my youth when I lived out east and went to country bars. It struck my fancies as of late, as I found the program relaxing to listen to as the bats fluttered about above the trees, which made evening come fast with that dark, unforgiving coniferous forest canopy. My program was not too loud, and I must admit the coffee did nothing for me as I only stayed awake for an hour. I woke to hear the telephone ringing around midnight. I knew it had to be Harold, the fucking prick. Making an old man like me, weak with age, stay up late past midnight for him was not so surprising of his character. Needless to say, I did not care how long the phone rang or how long it took me to limp towards it inside the house. Harold. Yes, I've gotten as far as Roseburg, the cab drivers, getting smokes and gasoline. I do apologize, Grady, for the... Don't mention it, Harold. Just try to be careful trekking that driveway I warned you about. This is the foothills of the Cascades, after all. I made my insistence clear, at least. The damn realty business must be paying well for an agent from Seattle to be handling such an out-of-the-way enterprise such as this. I had no clue who the buyer was, and really didn't care, for I had debts to pay, and I didn't blame them for wanting the house based off of photos and maps solely. It was as beautiful on the inside as it is the outside, and it's far away from any neighbors. Though the driveway was treacherous, it could be developed more. Anyone from Seattle moving this quickly and far away most likely could afford such a project if needed. I secretly hoped it was a young bachelor such as myself. Even though I was not selling on a whim, my old age truly prohibited me from staying here long. I was no longer young, just alone, weak, and sick. I drank some more coffee as I saw clouds had gathered so quickly. Soon I heard something rare to hear in these parts, a crash of thunder. It was accompanied by the most wonderful electrical storm I've seen since my youth in Tennessee. The strangest weather for southern Oregon. The rain came from those dark clouds, and though the moon had been full, the storm kept it hidden. I regret to say that I had thought to myself, serves that jerk right, ignoring all these warnings. Time moved so fast, yet the wait seemed to take forever. It was not unlike me to sleep on the porch during a rainstorm, but I had believed it was my duty to stay awake. Pretty soon I had depleted all of my sugar with very little coffee left for my guest. Serves him right, I said aloud to the empty house, and I brewed some more black coffee, which I drank and didn't mind. Now my guest can reheat some in the morning, should he want. I assured myself that there were rarely any complaints from Harold, as inconsiderate as he might be. The porch light attracted moths, which flew around my mug and gave me something to do as I swatted them away, and I heard the rain pounding on the tin porch covering. I turned the radio back on to my station. The jazz program had ended. They were merely reading short stories by local writers. I had listened to this radio station for years, and I used to be able to catch this program after a night of work, and How refreshing it was that the station still aired with the same programs without repeats. It seemed the old world was fading fast. It was evident to see by turning on the television or even changing the dial on the radio. Perhaps it was my old age, but times did seem to change so quickly, so rapidly during this time. The story I had tuned into was about a forbidden romance. Though the genre had its overuse, I found the narrator's voice soothing and the author's word choice meditative. Pretty soon the story ended and it was time for another. The radio host this time chose a gothic horror story. I forget the author's name, being an obscure fiction writer from the late 1890s, apparently from around these parts. The story took place in Europe, and it was about a traveler from New York who had a run-in with a wolf. And as the radio narrator reached this point, I heard a few coyotes howling in the distance. I smiled eventually, but was startled so much having been invested in the story. It was when the story had ended on a less scary tone and more depressing note that I heard what had to be Harold approaching out of the darkness. The damn fool had no flashlight. I couldn't tell where the idiot was. His steps drew nearer and nearer on that jagged limestone gravel, yet the 2 feet did not seem to match in pace. They seemed to quite literally drag. Was he really stupid enough to be rolling his luggage bag through the mud? Why, he needn't pack so much for a simple seller's signature to close a deal. Step, drag, step, drag. A clash of lightning, and soon, with my predictable but startling luck, the electricity went out, and with it, the porch lights. Harold, is that you there? I asked dumbly. Who else could it be? The wolf man? I laughed with this silly, fiction-inspired thought of Harold being a balding 40-year-old version transforming into the anthropomorphic lycanthrope, except with no hair between his wolf-like ears and perhaps wearing those thick, ugly circle glasses he loves to sport. Old Harry, I'd call him. This was amusing to think, but I began to grow impatient, as my guest could not be seen. I just heard his footsteps through the gravel. As he had to have been drawing nearer and nearer, he still was nowhere close enough to be seen in the dark. And soon the sound of panting accompanied his weary, dragging feet. It was then I truly felt bad for the man and became really concerned. This way, Harold, I shouted out to the darkness. There was still no answer. The rain was beginning to die down, and what was a crisp summer night quickly changed into a humid dawn. The sun had started to rise as I could hear the whippoorwills and quails hollering in the woods, but the clouds still kept it a very dark 5 o'clock in the morning. I was exhausted myself and half pissed that Harold didn't just give his trip more planning and communications ahead of time. I really didn't like surprise guests anyway, despite being a lonely old man. My concern really began to turn into panic and anxiety. The footsteps in the dark neared and neared, but seemed to never arrive. Harold, answer me, I shouted finally with anger. There was no voice, just that crunch of gravel and exhausted panting. Step, drag, step, drag. Suddenly, the source of the sound that kept me unseated, anxiously waving around the flashlight, had arrived. It was a creature of beauty, a dying buck. The stag had moss and lichen decorating his antlers, and it had been wounded. Most likely it had been the source of my nighttime entertainment earlier, that howling pack of coyotes. The poor beast finally fell, shaking and trembling. It grunted and sighed out one last breath, which signified that its suffering had ended. Tears came to my eyes as I truly felt for the beautiful creature. Sleep deprived and irritated and half concerned for Harold, I carried myself to my pull-out couch and rested, knowing there was no way in hell old fart like me should go out exploring the forest in the wet mud. Nor was there any way I could make a courtesy call without electricity. I could barely stand the idea of giving up the wait for Harold, but that damn fool, he really should have listened or planned it all out better. With this not so comforting conviction, I made peace and attempted to go back to sleep. The sky grew a brighter gray. Through the blanket of a more normal set of rain clouds that seemed more like what I expected out of the local weather. It was misty and calm. The birds finally sang me to a deep slumber, filled with dreams, inspired by the stories and music and events I had witnessed. I woke from a bloody carnal nightmare involving wolves' teeth and piano keys. It was the strangest dream I had had in a while, and I had nothing but the late-night caffeine in my guts to blame. It was nearly 11 a.m. and the damn porch lights were back on, wasting energy. The electricity had returned and the radio woke me up. After 15 minutes of processing my dreams and the loud radio, I moved slowly in my old age to turn it off and to gather the energy to drink some cold coffee and cut open a bagel. Finally, I made a call to the nearest neighbor. He was a modest man who I would have preferred to give my land to, but I had debts to pay after all. Joshua, I was expecting a guest last night. And in this weather? Yeah, he's my realtor. He didn't listen to my warnings, and I fear the poor fool is lost on my property, or worse. Joshua came with his truck, and having entered the South Trail, arrived at my house and helped me into the cab of his truck, and we slowly took off to search for Harold. The driveway, being a mile and a half long, bumped and rocked along, and it being as treacherous as I have said before, even in that modern truck of the time, built for mountain roads and ranches. My coffee spilled everywhere, and I apologized to Joshua. He said it was all right. Finally, we reached the point, and quite frantically I shouted for him to stop, as I saw a foot of shreds of a white polo shirt dangling from the limbs of a small tree. Joshua had an early model mobile phone. It was half the size of his meaty farm working arms, and he made a call to the authorities for me as I wept silently to myself. Joshua was a great neighbor, and I miss having him as one, despite how hard country living can be. He got out of the truck and helped me step onto the gravel, and we walked over, finding nothing more than very large human-like footprints in the mud. They were too long to be human, and the toes and claw points resembling those of a timberland wolf. I just figured that the tracks had overlapped. Days had passed, and Harold had not been found. The buyer had turned out to be, unfortunately, a logging company. They gave me the offer of a lifetime, and even though I had debts to pay, I had found myself refusing the offer. I hung the phone up and readied myself to watch the news. There had been missing persons reports and talks of world calamities as usual, the stock market being unpredictable as it is, and wars happening, and diseases, new ones at that, famine and injustices of all kinds. I grabbed the remote and switched it to The Joy of Painting with Bob Ross. As I looked behind me, hearing a noise, I saw through the screen door a shirtless man, and my heart stopped. It had been Harold, knocking slowly through the mesh onto the glass as the screen door had been shut, and gazing in with an alarming desperation, I saw a pair of hungry, reflective, yellow eyes.